All right, thank you. Welcome back. I'm now joined to discuss our professional indemnity segment by Malcolm Padayachee, who's the business head of liability, PI, and single projects, although we'll be focusing a lot on single projects and PI. Welcome, Malcolm.
Thank you, Simon.
And then, of course, I'm joined by my co-host for the rest of the program today, Anton Meyer, who's our business head of claims, which is, of course, where we ultimately get to demonstrate the value of the products that we provide. So welcome back, Anton.
Thank you, Simon.
All right, let's move through this. So we've split this segment into two areas. Our professional indemnity, which is where we're dealing with most of our traditional professions. And then we're going to look at the single projects elements a little bit after that. So when we're looking at 2019, we haven't quite gotten back up to the levels we were at. Incidentally, to the viewers, these are intimated claims, and there is a difference between intimated and incurred claims. That is ultimately the value that we could be liable for based on the summons and information that we've received on these third-party claims. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the claims volume. So that's the number of new claims that were registered in each year, and you can see 2021 just kind of starting to move upwards. Anton, why did we decide to start showing intimated claims rather than just sticking with incurred on these things?
Simon, it ties in with the long tail nature of these matters. And I think the concern is, if we go, 2013, for instance, if we look at 2013, the intimated claim was there. It showed those two claims. Right. But what actually happened was in the reserves and everything else, it got...
The incurred number would have been much
lower. The incurred number is because you don't know what's going on.
Sure.
You don't know when you're going to get the information. Sometimes it takes 2-3 years, as Gareth said, before you even have the information, let alone know where you're going to go with the claim. So we use that as a barometer just to show what is going on, or as a little image of what's going on in the market. So we're just trying to show what is out there and that it's not zero for 3 years and then all of a sudden it spikes, because when we do the next survey, it's not going to show how things have evolved. It shows in the financials, but yes, it's a far better barometer just to show what is going out there, sure, what type of cases are floating around.
Sure. Malcolm, did that surprise you, seeing those numbers?
No, not at all, because I think there's a couple of factors that affected specifically on the claims volume side of things. Prior to 2020, we embarked on an exercise that required us to re-underwrite our book of PI business, because that part of the business has been the most distressed business in the entire SHA portfolio.
As a frequency of severity losses.
Absolutely. So that required us to de-risk our portfolio, in which we had to exit certain classes of PI business, and that resulted in a loss in policy count.
Sorry, I just want to stop you there. Exiting a profession, that would surely be a last resort. We would sort of try to take some corrective action, but if there's a cheaper market out there, then...
Absolutely. Absolutely, and that's what we've done. We've taken aggressive corrective action in re-underwriting certain classes of PI business so that it's performing at acceptable levels. But as you say, in the competitive market out there, we still
Someone
lost
might
a lot
be
of
prepared to take
count.
that business on because they haven't had the loss history that we've had on that particular
Even
profession.
Distressed risks have been taken on by competitors at significantly cheaper premiums than ours.
Yeah, someone said it's kind of like just kicking a can down the road. You are going to have to pick it up eventually. So you might get 3 or 4 good years before the tail comes around.
Absolutely, and that's the long-tailed nature of PI business, which Garrett's alluded to as well. And we started to see that. In 2020, building up to 2020, coupled with the shutdown of businesses due to COVID, we saw fewer claims being noted as a result of being exposed to fewer policies as a result of our cleaning out of our PI business. But in 2021, you can see those numbers started to normalize as businesses got back together, work continued, and we started to see claims come through.
Yeah, it's almost back to sort of, let's say, pre-pandemic, or someone said BC, before COVID.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're starting to see that trend.
I know that there were some professions that didn't display this trend where the number of claims continued to rise, and I think we'll get to those in a moment. I just want to move on to single projects. Some of our viewers might not be aware of what this kind of insurance is all about. Malcolm, do you want to just give us a sort of bird's eye view of that?
Yeah, I mean, so maybe just speaking about these claims numbers initially, is that the construction industry in South Africa has been in a depressed state now for quite a few years, as there's a severe lack of government projects to stimulate,
So these like infrastructure-based,
large infrastructure project. I mean, just last week, Sanral announced cancellation of 17 billion rand worth of roads tenders due to flaws in the tender process. I mean, this has massive impact on the businesses and industry that rely on this work. As a result of that, we're seeing a significant decline in demand for single project PI policies. And those numbers may be a bit misleading. It shows low frequency, but in fact, there's just an absence of demand for single project PI policies. Single project PI policies, as you know, are multi-year policies covering multiple insureds, and those policies are live to up to 10 years in terms of local insurers' treaties. And what we're seeing now is that due to the lack of demand for new SPPI policies, we're starting to see claims come through from older policies, and that's reflective of the stats coming through.
So we've got the older claims coming through now, and not a lot of great new business coming in to kind of top up the float at the front end.
Correct, John. Most of the 25 new notifications actually refer to periods probably about 4 or 5 years ago. So it's not new claims coming through now. It's all the historic stuff, as you said, long tail or long period policies, but they still remain active. So that's the bulk of the claims that came in.
And just adding on to the long tail nature of PI claims, our historical data showed that it used to develop in cycles of 5 years, but our recent data shows that this tail has extended, as Gareth alluded to as well, to up to 7 to 8 years. And there's various factors that affect that. It's the arduous litigation process that we're exposed to, legal strategies employed by attorneys on matters, the absence or the availability of experts and witnesses, and the general cost of PI claims. We've had situations where clients experience what we call litigation fatigue and lose interest in pursuing a matter that's in litigation.
That could be a strategy.
Absolutely, that could be a strategy, which contributes to the factors of the long-tailed increasing over time.
When it ultimately gets settled, of course, now you're dealing with, in the case of that 2013 claim that Gareth was talking about, you've got all the inflationary pressures. Money's kind of halved its value in that 7-year period. So, one can see how that could get quite complicated to price as well, because you're having to price for that today.
Absolutely. And that being said, is that, although these numbers look low, what we have found is that when a claim is notified under the SPPI policy, it's a fairly large claim because we have large limits assigned to these policies, and that's the nature of it. The reason why clients procure SPPI policies is to access these higher limits of indemnity.
Sure. Okay, that's scary. All right, so let's move into averages. So in the PI area, I mean, the graph looks like it drops much more than it does, but 2019, we saw the average claim go from 3.7 million to 3.3 million. I mean, it has dipped. Is that expected? Is that also related to COVID?
So I mean, as you can see, it's not a massive dip on the PI side of things. And it's consistent with the de-risking of our portfolio, where we've lost a large number in policy count, exposing us thus to a lower number of claims being notified. And that lower number of claims affects the averages of these PI claims noted in the slide here.
I wonder if, Anton, we were just talking now about that sort of glut of claims that are stuck in the court system. So during that sort of go slow because of the lockdowns, nothing was going through the court system, which could indicate that there were no legal fees being incurred in that period of time either, that we might still see that coming through the pipeline. So 2021 could actually look quite different.
Oh, yes.
Once we go through the final numbers
Yes.
in a couple of years' time.
Yeah, no, 100%, Simon. I think, once again, because of the long tail nature, you'll always see a sort of a dip towards the end of the year that's so close. I mean, we've already incurred costs pertaining to the 2021, 2020, and 2019 years so far this year.
Yeah.
So if you have to take it as at today, the figures will already have changed.
Right.
And lots of the costs that the guys incur, absolutely spike in the beginning when they prepare for everything, then it sort of dulls down a little bit while you're waiting for trial, and then of course it goes through the roof.
Just before Christmas.
Not always, but
Yeah.
you have these spikes throughout the year.
I do find it interesting though that, if I look in our SME portfolio, we still have a lot of clients that buy what could possibly just be a statutory limit of indemnity. They've been told to have 1 million. Now, if you're buying 1 million of PI cover, but the average is actually 3.3 million, that you're going to land up with an absolute disaster when the first claim comes through.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Look, you can never tell anyone what type of limit to buy because, you say 20 million and then the claim is 50 million.
Yeah, whatever you can afford.
But at the end of the day, at those averages, 1 million rand, it's especially if it's contractual or statutory, like in certain other areas, it's certainly not enough. That's the bare minimum that an industry body would look at and say, let's peg it here.
That's your starting point.
Yeah.
I mean, 1 million rand can be expunged just purely by defense costs, defending the insured in a potential claim, thus leaving him exposed to indemnity if he is found liable.
Sure.
So it's a massive risk that.
Yeah, and also the complexity plays into that. I mean, we chatted about it the other day. We had one bill from one attorney for a period of about 3 months, but highly complex matter, of about 5 million rand. In a couple of
it'd be
months.
like being billed for more hours than there are in the day. Was the guy dreaming about the case
No,
as well,
you see,
and you got billed for that?
The sad part is there's specialists. You have your,
Right,
your,
there's a team of
there's a whole team of people. So and trust me, we scrutinize these things. But I mean, when you look at this and the complexity that's involved in some of these claims, you don't have a choice. You can't just run in and think you're going to just argue it.
Absolutely.
Specialist engineers aren't cheap.
Let's talking of engineers. I mean, let's look at that single project environment. I guess the average is easily swayed up or down because of the low number of claims. Any comments there, Miles?
So I've mentioned earlier on that PI was the most distressed book of business in the SHA portfolio, and single projects contributed largely to that as well. Coupled with the depressed economy and the decline of large infrastructure projects, we saw fewer risks, or we saw a decline in demand for single project policies, as a result of which we secured fewer policies, and that's impacted that those figures declining as well. The other factor that contributed to this was due to the adverse claims that we've experienced in the single project PI policy, we curtailed our appetite drastically in respect of single projects. We reduced capacity in the market, we increased rates, increased deductibles, and tightened up our wording to manage our risk to acceptable levels. As a result of which, we saw few opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to keep it sustainable.
Absolutely, and that's the reason why it reduced to those numbers. But having said that, the market in general has reduced their appetite for single project policies. According to my knowledge, there's just only one other market except for SHA that expresses an appetite to underwrite single project PI policies locally.
And I mean, globally, is this a trend? Is this high risk business everywhere? This is not unique to SA.
Absolutely. Globally, single project PI policies is almost not available.
Okay.
And when it is available, it's extraordinarily expensive.
Sure.
Making it unaffordable for clients. So it is absolutely a global problem.
What's the alternative, though, to taking out a single? Each professional just takes out their own cover.
Correct. I mean, that's the trend that
Okay.
we're seeing following our reduced capacity in the market and appetite, is that clients are pushing the risk down to the respective professionals and contractors executing the projects. But the risk there is or lies there is that if the contractor or the professional fails to comply with these policy conditions or fails to pay his premium, the ultimate client ends up being unprotected should there be a claim arising out of these professionals' responsibilities. Whereas with the single project, the client has the comfort of controlling the insurances from a principal point of view.
Yeah, makes sense.
Simon, just for your interest, if we had a year-to-date 2022 on that slide, it would have gone up,
Okay.
given what's happened on some of the
It
matters so
changes
far.
quite rapidly.
Yeah.
Correct.
Let's look at some of the professions that bucked the trend. Going from 2019 to 2021, there were more than just these two. I picked on them, I think, ironically, because of the legal profession being in there. But the number of claims actually went up. So this is not the quantum. This is the number of actual claims incidents. Went up by 33% between 2019. So something was happening in lockdown in the legal fraternity. And then the accountants, that went up by 122%. Why?
Yeah, I mean, it is surprising that it seems, though, that the legal profession and the accounting profession have been extremely busy during COVID, I guess, apart from medical professionals.
With a bunch of lawyers suing accountants, it seems, and then vice versa.
Vice versa.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the claims that contributed to the legal profession, that 33%, largely attributed to crime-type claims, where attorneys where employees of attorneys were misappropriating monies from trust accounts, and also impersonation fraud via email scams is the other trend that we picked up. Now, despite the awareness created by the media, social media, the respective legal practice councils, attorneys are still falling victim to impersonation, fraud, cybercrime events. And this is the trend that we're seeing that's influenced that 33%.
Okay.
On the accounting side, similar issues arose. Impersonation fraud, especially in accountants that provide payroll services,
trust services,
payroll services, company secretarial, trust services, where they have access to their clients' accounts and make payments out of those business accounts. And they're falling victim to email scams as well in terms of impersonation
I saw a few
fraud.
in the list, in fact, quite a few tax-related issues. So, either not submitting tax returns on time or getting the numbers wrong.
Yeah, that's the other trend, is that accountants failing to timeously file their clients' tax returns, which result in SARS imposing fines or penalties on their clients.
And then they hold the accountant liable. So
based on negligence.
Based on your negligence.
And then the other factor that contributed to that was, I mean, there's a sharp focus on auditors in the media, as we all read, where auditors are alleged to incur PI claims as a result of failing to pick up mismanagement in companies they audit or fraud in companies they audit, resulting in claims against auditors. So those are the three more important trends that we're seeing that contribute to that 122% increase.
I didn't put it up on the screen, but the sort of in third place behind these two we had architects, which was about a 17% movement in claims upwards. Why would that be?
So I mean, architects are trending in the same vein as engineers recently. Because what we're finding is that clients are not wanting to appoint different professionals on a project, have a separate contract with an engineer, separate contract with the architect, and a separate contract with the QS. They're tending to appoint architects as a principal agent, and thereby passing over the risk to employ all these professionals under the project management principal architect type arrangement.
And that is actually something that we commented on in the last risk review. So it's definitely a trend that we've seen continuing.
And clients are holding these architects to account when something goes wrong on site, as opposed to previously, if it was an engineer's fault, the client would go after the engineer or the QS. Now it just goes over the goes
Yeah.
for the architect, and the architect has to respond to that.
And he has to figure out, well, who's liable in the background if he wants to.
Yeah, but the additional problem that we're facing there as well, that also triggers some of these claims, is like Malcolm was saying, the construction industry as a whole has been under pressure for a couple of years. So, and lots of times, you'll find that the architect's the only man standing after the contractor, goes into business rescue or, eventually ends up liquidated. So that also contributes to
The deeper pockets.
correct.
And it is quite risky because I know some of the ones that I've seen, the architects don't buy as much cover as the engineers do in many instances. So, they could be left with a chunky claim and not enough cover in place, particularly in the smaller businesses.
Yeah, when I started in PI quite a number of years ago, I'm not going to say how many, the average limit was about R1 million. And I don't think that's increased substantially,
Yeah.
not
Yeah,
in
that's
relation to where
absolutely
things have
frightening.
gone.
Yeah.
No, that dial hasn't moved
Yeah.
substantially at all.
Okay, I just want to touch on this briefly. We don't have a significant portfolio of broker PI at SHA. In our survey that brokers took part in, we asked them, have you had any incidents reported to you that could be potential PI claims? So it's not necessarily actual PI claims. And 16% of brokers said that they thought they might have some claims related to the contingent business interruption following the pandemic. 14% said they might have some exposure following the Sasria riots. And 5% said that they'd had some issues where their clients had suffered cyber attacks and there wasn't any cyber insurance in place. Malcolm, can you just kind of talk to this?
Yeah, I mean, Garrett spoke about systemic events, and these typical systemic events have brought brokers into sharp focus in the media recently, where allegations are being made against brokers in that they fail to provide adequate advice or procure the adequate cover to cover these systemic type events. And what we've seen as well is that the courts tend to favor more public favored interpretations on contracts, thus creating greater onus on brokers to ensure that the level of advice they're giving clients is correct. It's rather unfortunate because brokers are essentially expected to have a crystal ball to tell the future.
And to know about hundreds of different
of
products
unforeseen
and exposures.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it creates a difficult space for brokers, in my opinion. So the point I'm trying to make is that brokers need to ensure that the level of cover they're procuring is adequate to cover these exposures that they face.
Right, and I think probably the spotlight will be on records of advice,
Yeah.
and as has been over the last few years.
Yeah, there's been a couple of positive rulings in the courts recently that basically does show, there must be negligence and that type of thing for brokers. The problem is, the cost to get to that point.
It's defense costs.
Correct.
Yeah.
I mean, insurers also grappling with these systemic exposures in that insurers are exposed to multiple policies responding to a single event, creating accumulation concerns from an insurer perspective. So we too have our challenges in dealing with these
We're going to chat to Sizwe just after this about the cyber, and I know that certainly be one of the most difficult to arrange proper accumulation cover, where you could have 1,000 clients kind of being hit in an event, maybe not a single event, but a sort of a virus or ransomware attack. So yeah, point taken. I really don't like putting up stats like this because it does imply that that things are going wrong in the professional services space. So we interviewed about 200 professionals who were not clients of SHA, and then we interviewed about 140 who were actually already clients. So it was quite a big pool of professionals that we spoke, the largest pool actually that we've ever had. And this was the response that came back. So more than half of the professionals said that they've noticed a drop in the standard of graduates who are arriving, to work with them. 48%, a huge number, said that they'd lost senior staff who'd actually emigrated to other countries for better opportunities. And then finally, an issue kind of separate from these two. Maybe we can talk about the first two before we get to the scope issues. What is the impact here on PI, Malcolm?
Simon, I mean, this seems to be consistent with previous surveys that we've done,
Yeah.
where an alarmingly high percentage of our respondents indicated that there's a drop of standards of graduates coming through tertiary institutions. And coupled with a high number of senior experienced professionals exiting due to immigration is a concern. We need these...
Like a perfect storm of stuff there,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We need these highly skilled professions to transfer skills to these junior professionals coming out of tertiary institutions, because they don't have the practical know-how when practicing their profession or going into practice. And we're starting to see that in claims as well, where large projects or appointments are delegated to junior professionals without the proper supervision or adequate supervision. Juniors make critical mistakes in the execution of their services, which a senior, well-skilled professional would not have made, thus avoiding claims. And we're losing that. So we're seeing this massive gap between junior professionals coming into the profession and senior professionals exiting without transferring these skills to close that gap.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why we published the survey and will continue to talk about these points going forward is because we believe that as an industry and with our brokers, we have to work with clients to try and find solutions to these problems. I think Ian Furr will be talking a little bit about this in his session a bit later. But it is very worrying. You certainly, we don't really do medical malpractice anymore, but you certainly wouldn't want this to be the case in the medical fraternity. And why should it be any different for attorneys and engineers, and often where there are lots of safety critical things that could go wrong? So I think that definitely requires ongoing conversation. A third, just coming back to the architects that we were talking about, a third of the respondents said that they were pressured by their clients, or I suppose just economic pressure, to take on work outside of their normal scope. Risks related to that, Malcolm?
We see that as a result of a depressed economy, that firms are forced to take on additional work outside of their normal scope just to keep their staff employed. And the risk is that if they don't inform the insurers timeously of this additional scope, and not allowing the insurer to appreciate the risk and charge an appropriate rate for the risk, they run the risk of not having a claim covered in the event that a claim emanates from the scope that's outside of their normal services.
Not to mention that they just might not have the skills to deliver that professional
Absolutely.
service.
Absolutely. Or the resources.
Yeah. All right, let's move on here. Again, we use different icons so that we don't get bored with reporting on the same stat every year. But this is just an ongoing story that we have across all of our lines of business. 38% of professionals saying they don't enter into legally binding contracts with their clients. And then on the right-hand side, 20% not really having anything in place for recording negligence issues. Anton, let me ask you, talking about not having a system in place for recording incidents, how does that create problems for us?
Simon, I think it creates problems for everyone, including the insureds. Because at the end of the day, like I mentioned, these matters are rather complex. And if something goes unnoticed or is attempted to sort it out themselves or between parties or whatever, yes, sometimes 1 out of 10, you get lucky and you get it sorted out. 9 times out of 10, 2 years down the line, everyone's so angry, everyone's got 4 sets of attorneys, and no one wants to settle, no one wants to talk, no one wants to just move forward. So then it's a huge fight. So it becomes a nightmare to try and unravel a situation like that, a year or 2 down the line. Whereas if it's noticed immediately, everyone can start working on it immediately. And then it's a lot easier to sort out a problem when it's this big versus trying to sort out a problem when it's exploded already.
I should point out, sorry, Malcolm, before you comment there, that the viewers might be thinking this is an SME issue. This actually came out of our corporate PI survey, where the practices were quite big. Sorry, Malcolm.
Yeah. I just want to mention that the other risk they face in not having a proper system to record negligence incidents is that they could fall foul of not advising or notifying the insurer timelessly, and may fall foul of late notification provisions on a policy, and thus having their claim potentially
Please see
rejected or
attached
declined.
judgment with notification of claim.
No, we get that often.
The contractual issue?
So, yeah, I mean, the study is really concerning. I mean, to think that in this day and age, in a landscape that is highly litigious, that professionals don't enter into legally binding contracts with their clients. I mean, a contract by its very nature sets out the respective parties' rights, duties, and obligations in the execution of the services. And it becomes difficult for us as insurers to defend an insured when there's no contract in place and where he feels he's not negligent. We face an uphill battle, in the absence of a contract. So it's absolutely critical that before an appointment is agreed upon or accepted, that a legally binding written contract is signed by both parties, acceptable to both parties.
I mean, it strikes me that the two of you are attorneys, so correct me here if I'm wrong, but if we saw this trend when we had our general liability chat with Manisha last week, and she pointed out the same thing. She said this is an issue. Now, in those instances on the liability side, I guess it just reverts to a common law type position. That's what we were defending the insured on that basis because there's no contract. But in the professional space, I'm assuming because you're talking about a professional versus just an ordinary person, not a professional, that the odds are automatically stacked against the professional because they're the one perceived to have all the knowledge.
Correct.
So without a contract,
that's why they're appointed in the first place.
Yeah.
I wouldn't need to appoint an engineer or an attorney.
Yeah.
Or
I'm relying on you to
that's why
give me the advice. Yeah,
correct.
Absolutely.
I think the other thing that I can just also mention, quite a substantial amount of claims in the 2020 period followed from a scenario where people had contracts, and then there were lots of variations done 2, 3, 4 years during the contract period.
Oh.
Okay. And those were never recorded.
The contract that Jack built.
Correct.
Nobody checking it in between, making sure one part talks to another.
Yeah. And that's exactly the concern, because we've seen on a number of occasions that the parties also do change during the period.
Yeah.
Whether the client sells off the business to someone else, or whether there's a new contract, or whether a contract goes in business rescue. And then all of a sudden you've got new people in, and there's one contract that says, you will build a house. And meantime, down the line, someone expected a castle. Mm-hmm. It's that type of scenario. So the contracts must continuously...
That's what happened to Jacob Zuma. Kandla. He just wanted a little house, ended up with that. So,
and a fire pool.
So, on that note, it brings us to the end of the PI segment. So Malcolm, from you, any last words that you'd like to leave our audience with?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing a sharp rise in impersonator fraud type claims and via email scams. So our advice is that brokers need to ensure that their clients who are exposed to these type of claims have proper risk management systems in place to avoid these claims, and where they do have cover in place, to ensure that they have the correct level of cover, or an acceptable level of cover. I mean, we had a recent claim where an employee of an attorney misappropriated almost 11 million rand from the trust account, and the attorney only had 2 million rand worth of cover.
Wow.
And this could be devastating for the attorney because he's still liable for the balance of the claim. So appropriate levels of cover is the point that I want to make as we leave. Thanks.
Thanks, Malcolm. Anton, anything from you?
Simon, from our side, I think just once again, the contracts, the contract certainty. I mean, that is something that we see regularly throughout most of the casualty business. Make sure there's a contract in place. It's very difficult to try and protect your client's interests, where everyone understands that they weren't liable, but the contract doesn't speak to these specific duties and responsibilities. Absolutely something that everyone needs to keep in mind.
Great. Well, thank you. Malcolm, thanks for joining us. Anton, you're going to stick around with me. We'll be right back with our cyber chat.